Metaphor Refantazio is the culmination of what the Persona team has been working on up to this point. And I'm not really sure how else to talk about this game, so let's jump straight into the review. Also, for those who are worried about spoilers, I have kept all footage shown in the background to the end of the first dungeon, as well as I'm going to discuss as little of them as possible within this video. So, let's properly begin. And where to start, indeed. Because I was interested in picking this game up since the day it was released, because they effectively just pitched it to me as medieval Persona. So, that was already something worth being interested in. Since, in case you weren't aware, Persona 5 Royal is my favorite game of all time, and Persona 4 Golden easily scores within my top 10. And personally, I love the fantasy aesthetic. I just generally really like fantasy stuff. It's probably my favorite setting for a story that you can have. So combine that together, and I was interested straight off the bat. Given I kind of ignored the game when it first got announced, because it got announced alongside Persona 5 Tactica and Persona 3 Reload, because what was Atlas thinking? But either way, this isn't the time for those two games. This is the time for Metaphor. So let's get straight into the combat. Because, wow, it sure is Mega 10 combat. If you've played almost any other Atlas game, this game plays like that. Which is not a bad thing, because I really enjoy that style of combat. It just means it's not exactly the most interesting thing to talk about. But it does have some changes, so let's start by addressing those. First and foremost, you can kill enemies in the overworld by draining their health bar to 0. And that doesn't sound like that big of a deal because it is grindy, but it also means you can super easily deal with low level or weak enemies, meaning you don't have to slog through combat against enemies that are going to die in a couple turns anyway. But you can still fight them, so you don't have to just get into combat, run away, and then run through using your invincibility frames. I really appreciate that, because it really helps out against those fights, or if you're going back to an earlier area. And speaking of helping out in fights, you do not know how nice it is to be able to stun an enemy first turn. Since if you break an enemy's guard in the overworld and then transition to turn-based combat, they have to skip their first turn or two. And, okay, cool, you get some free damage. That mechanic single-handedly allowed me to go up against enemies that were way higher level than me, and I should not have been fighting at that point, especially in a turn-based RPG. Since at the bare minimum, it allows you to set up your buffs and your characters before the enemy can attack, allowing you to be fully ready to fight the first turn the enemy can strike back. And I think my favorite new addition to combat is the synthesis attacks, since in the easiest way possible to describe them, they cost 2 turns, use the MP of 2 party members, but allow you to use stronger skills. So for example, in the early game, you get access to medium damaging elemental spells before you should have access to them, but at a higher cost. And that's great. The early and mid game, you're able to use spells that are a level or 2 higher than you should have access to. But in the late game, it allows for super unique, really powerful attacks that incentivize using team building and having really interesting team compositions instead of just, here's a mage, here's a tank, here's a healer, here's our DPS. Because you might want 3 mages so you can get the advantages of synthesis skills. It makes using the archetypes so much more interesting. And we will get to the archetype, but aside from those new additions I just mentioned, it's as streamlined and as fun as it is in games like Persona 5, SMT 5, Persona 4. It's fun. It feels a bit slower to me than Persona 5's combat, which might just be animations being slightly longer or the menus being slightly less responsive. Frankly, it might just be visual effects. But it's still incredibly fun, and I love it. But I think it's finally time to talk about this game's main feature, its main new mechanic, its main gimmick, whatever you want to call it, the archetype system. After completing the first rank of any social link, or as this game calls them, followers, you obtain the power of a brand new archetype, which fills in the same role as demons or personas from other Atlas games. Except for the fact, there's only 14 of them. They really shrunk down the number in this game, and that isn't necessarily a bad thing because they're all usable and they're all good, focused on a specific thing, and you still have inheriting skills and a lot of stuff that allows you to customize them to your heart's content. But the new limited system actually makes it so much easier to customize archetypes and get those specific skills you want. So, I actually quite like it. Do I prefer it to the demon system from SMT and the persona system from, well, Persona? Not exactly. But as an alternative to make this game stand out on its own within an already very similar set of games, I think it's great. I would not like to see this return in future Persona games, but if we were to get sequels to Metaphor specifically, I would absolutely be down for this feature returning. But let's talk about the downside. The designs of the archetypes suck. They're well designed on a technical level, but they're just not interesting visually and feel very generic. And on top of that, the design of the system causes the first rank of a lot of the social links to be story related because, you know, the game wants to make sure you have a handful of archetypes to play with no matter what. The problem with that means in a game where social links were removed down to 8 ranks, a good chunk of characters only get 7. And I'll talk about the social link system later in the video and probably in a whole video of its own, but for now, I do want to make the note that it does hinder them. And finishing up the more combat and dungeon side of this video, I want to talk about the dungeons themselves. And thankfully, every single dungeon in this game was handmade. There is not a single procedurally generated dungeon in this entire game. And I am so glad, because easily the worst parts about Persona 5, Persona 4, Persona 3 are that specific setup. Mementos and Tartarus, as well as all of the dungeons in P4. Because it causes the layout to be boring and repetitive. But since all the dungeons are handcrafted in this, it's really fun and I like exploring the dungeons. I loved exploring them in Persona 5 and I love exploring them here. And while the side quest dungeons aren't nearly as grandiose, they still have a decent amount of stuff to do in them. It's not just run through to the boss. There's a couple side pathways where you can get chests, and a handful of them also have a secret collectible that I'm not going to talk about because spoilers. But they do have it. So, with that done, let's talk a little bit about the daily life. You got your social stats, you got your followers, you got odd jobs you can work, you have side dungeons you can do. Pretty standard affair for what is effectively a spin-off of Persona. The odd jobs, you know, usually maybe some gold, or really, it's nothing that notable. The best you're gonna get are monster bounties, which are more so tied to the side dungeons you can do. And the social stats, I think, level up at a really good pace. I always felt like I should be doing them, but I never felt pressured to do so, and as someone who had maxed out on all social stats and finished every single social link and the vast majority of side dungeons, I had like 2 weeks left where I just couldn't do anything because I ran out of content. So you have time to do things at your own pace. You don't have to rush specific things to make sure you get them done, and you can even take a couple days on a single dungeon, which I would never do, but you can do it. Of course, I'm leaving out a part of it, but that's mostly the Gauntlet Runner stuff, which, look, I'm gonna be honest, what do you want me to say? It's basically the same thing that we already have, just more limited. You have less options, you have less social links you can do. There's not much to say about it. Not that it's bad, more so, there just isn't much worth mentioning that isn't already covered in the broad strokes of the system. There are other things you can do in daily life. I think one of the main things is just going to the rock with people's heads on it every single day because you get some mag out of it. It's really helpful. If you're wondering what mag is, it's a currency. So with that done, I'm going to talk about some miscellaneous stuff and then cover the spoilers very lightly within story. So let's just start off the more miscellaneous stuff with graphics. It looks good. It's stylized. It's Atlas. What do you want me to say that I haven't said about all of their other games? Like, there's a couple, like, minor things I don't like. Personally, I don't like how jaggedy the text boxes are, or the weird cloud dust particles that are everywhere. But the vast majority of my issues are really just nitpicks that really don't take away that much from the game. So, honestly, I think it looks good. Models are pretty solid. Assets generally look good. Most of the cutscenes look good. And the 2D cutscenes, I mean, they're great. One of my biggest issues is the intro cutscene, specifically the one that plays after the first intro cutscene. That was kind of boring, but for the most part, I think the game looks great and has a great mix of styles. And moving on to the next thing, the cast. I think the characters are great. I think the voice acting was done well. I really like the vast majority of the cast. All of the party members are fun. I like the social links. And I think the main antagonist is really well done. And might be one of my favorite Atlas villains. Is he my favorite? Probably not. But he's probably up there and probably makes top 3 if I were to actually write down a list. And the English voice cast is British, English, whatever you want to say. And frankly, I think there's a lot of untapped potential in English voice actors, because seriously, there's so many good ones. Look at all of the Xenoblade games. And then you just don't see them again, or they're only in very specific games. And it's like, why? There are so many great actors. You can use them alongside American voice talent. I don't think that'd be that much of an issue, and I'd love to see more of it. And this game has that, and I think it's really solid. And with that, we'll move on to our final section of the video, the story. I'm going to try to keep it as spoiler-free as possible, but if you want to go in completely blind, or as blind as you can, this is your point to click off of the video. The rest of the video is dedicated to lightly talking about the story and trying to step around the spoilers as best as I can. And honestly, it's great. The story is overall fantastic, with a ton of great twists and turns and really good foreshadowing. The vast majority of moments I was either able to call it before it happened, or when it did happen, I realized, oh, that's what all of this meant. And genuinely, some of those moments caught me off guard, and I was thoroughly invested throughout the entire main campaign, because all of the twists and turns are so engaging and enthralling. I love this main story. Is it my favorite? Honestly, no. Atlas has made some incredible stories, and I don't think it's nowhere near as good as Persona 4 and Persona 5 are to me, but it is still absolutely amazing, with amazing turns, great characters, and it really uses its strong suits to tell the story as best as it can. The characters, the foreshadowing, it's all done so excellently. Even within the first dungeon or two, it was great. Learning what characters were on your side or weren't, what characters switched sides, all of that was so great. And while most story arcs are kind of tapped off in the same way, they're all done with their own unique twist that makes it engaging. And that's the thing about this game, though. It's really engaging throughout, and in a lot of ways, it's greater than the sum of its parts, but I just don't like it nearly as much as Persona 4 and 5. And that's not because Metaphor is bad, but it's just because Will Metaphor is technically better on every level. The other games just have charm or exceed at one specific thing so much better. And genuinely, I love this game. It is definitely worth trying if you are a fan of Persona, if you're a fan of Mega 10, but seriously, what did you all think?